Okay. Also known as Universal Basic Income, or UBI for short, basic income is an unconditional income paid to every individual person. It solves the problem of how to get spending money into the hands of ordinary people so they can buy things. People being able to buy things is necessary for a properly functioning economy. There is no basic income today, and that's a problem because people can't buy all the things that the economy would happily sell them. Instead of directly paying people a basic income, our government indirectly tries to push money to people through policies that facilitate private sector job creation. We are already handing people money. We're just hiding it behind the fact that we're also handing them jobs. And because we're afraid to hand people their money directly, some people end up falling through the cracks. Other people are forced to do otherwise unnecessary work in order to earn enough money to survive. Meanwhile, the financial sector, Wall Street, becomes our government's vehicle for pumping money into the world. And because most of that money never actually sees the pockets of ordinary people, we try to compensate by overfeeding the financial sector and forcing more money to trickle out of it. The unsurprising result is that the financial sector becomes less and less stable and collapses in on itself every so often. Lack of basic income is why our economy suffers from a repeated cycle of recessions. It's why the global financial crisis happened in 2008. It's why we were improperly equipped to handle the COVID-19 pandemic. It's why we have poverty. Basic income is not a nice to have bonus kind of thing. It's an if we don't have it, we're in real trouble kind of thing. We don't have basic income. We're in real trouble. We have been for a while. Okay, before we go any further, I want to clear up a couple points of potential confusion. Firstly, there's no such thing as a non-universal basic income. Basic income goes equally to everyone. And by everyone, I mean all the adults in the economy where we implement the basic income. So whether you call it basic income, universal basic income, or UBI, you're talking about the same thing. Secondly, basic income doesn't have to be an amount of money that meets people's basic needs. Many people feel that such an amount is both achievable and desirable, but it's not part of the definition. The amount could be less or it could be more, and it still counts as a basic income. Basic income is basic only in the sense that everyone gets it. The income itself is basic, not what it buys. The reason I'm being explicit about this is that people tend to make a lot of assumptions about what the amount of the basic income should be, or what kinds of taxes or other policies would best go along with the basic income. Not everyone is careful about separating their desired parameters for basic income from the concept of basic income itself. This makes basic income seem more complicated than it really is. So let's get back to the basics of basic income. Basic income is just the same amount of free money for everyone. You don't have to need it. You don't have to prove that something is preventing you from working. You just get it, even if you have a job or another source of income, even if you're rich. Weirdly for me, and I think this is somewhat unusual, the first thing I really understood about basic income was that it was possible to do a basic income. We could afford to hand everyone this free money. So I never really had to justify basic income on moral grounds or anything like that. I just knew that if we could hand everyone free money, it would be really silly not to. So the first question that everyone asks about basic income is how to pay for it. Unfortunately, basic income supporters are notoriously bad at providing a satisfactory answer to this question. I'll give you the real answer right now. There's only one way to pay for a basic income: by printing money and adding it to the economy. What? Now you're thinking, I was with you, Alex, until you said that. Well, this assertion might actually be less controversial than you expect. You see, the way I like to think about it is that anytime the government spends, they're printing money. They're printing money in the sense that they're adding money to a part of the economy that wouldn't otherwise have that money. Wait a minute. Now it might sound like I'm saying nothing, and that's kind of true. Whenever the government spends money, they spend money. Big deal, right? But there's a reason why I'm using the framing of money printing to describe government spending. The reason is that it's always going to be true that government spending adds new money to the economy. This is true regardless of whether the government happens to be removing money from another part of the economy at the same time. In other words, removing old money through taxation doesn't change the fact that the government is adding new money when they spend. But doesn't the removal of the old money create room for the addition of the new money? Well, if you're just adding money to the exact same spot you took it from, then sure, but then you've done exactly nothing. If you try to do anything more complicated, it depends. Removing money from one part of the economy doesn't magically create room to add money to another part of the economy. In order for the government's money to be able to buy something, the economy has to have something it wants to sell. In order for basic income to buy goods and services, those goods and services have to be available for purchase. While tax revenue may be required for government procedure, it is not what ultimately makes it possible for our economy to have a basic income. It's not what makes any form of government spending possible. The right question to ask isn't, the implication of this is that when the government spends, they're not spending taxpayer dollars. Basic income does not come from taxpayers. It goes to everybody. The right question to ask isn't, can we afford a basic income? The right question to ask is, how much basic income can our economy handle without causing inflation or other problems? What is the optimal level of basic income for our economy right now? To what extent will various taxes and other economic policies increase or decrease that amount? On its own, the concept of basic income is simple. It's free money for everyone, but it can be hard to wrap our heads around how a simple basic income fits into our complicated economy. The good news is that basic income simplifies our economy for us, or rather, much of our economy's complexity stems from lack of basic income. So I'm going to describe to you how the economy works with the basic income, and we can work backwards from there. At its core, the economy is a system that produces goods and services for people. We can imagine it as a giant vending machine. We put money into the machine, and the candy bars it spits out for people to consume are the economy's products. In this admittedly idealized economy, money flows only in one direction, from consumers' pockets into the machine. Goods and services flow in the opposite direction, from the machine to consumers. The actual people are the ones who get to eat the candy bars. Now, let's say the vending machine is fully restocked every morning, but it's only able to fit so many candy bars. In other words, our economy has limited resources. It only has the capacity to produce so many goods and services every day. No amount of putting money back into the machine is going to get consumers more candy bars than there physically are in the machine. To allow them to buy the candy bars, we can provide consumers with a limited daily allowance of money to spend into the machine. That's our basic income. If the amount of the basic income is too low, candy bars will remain unclaimed in the machine at the end of every day. If the amount is too high, then there will be a shortage of candy bars. Consumers will have extra money left over that they wanted to spend. Clearly, there's exactly one level of basic income that allows consumers to claim the machine's full contents every day without also causing a shortage. There's exactly one amount of basic income that allows consumers to buy all the goods and services that the economy can produce for them. This sweet spot is what I like to call the natural level of basic income for our vending machine economy. If the vending machine changes its average level of prices, then the natural level of basic income changes along with it. For example, if the prices of candy bars double, then the natural level of basic income doubles. Every basic income has a corresponding price level. If the basic income doesn't match the price level, we can adjust some combination of both to correct the difference. Let's say candy bars are $1 and consumers receive enough basic income to buy all the candy bars twice over. We can bring the basic income to its natural level either by doubling the price of candy bars or by cutting the basic income in half. In any case, the economy's productive capacity is ultimately what determines the amount of stuff that can be bought. No matter what the prices are, the natural level of basic income reflects the same amount of real purchasing power. So, in our vending machine economy, when we think about what $1 is worth, we're thinking in terms of how many candy bars it can buy. If $1 is stable, then the average price of candy bars doesn't change. The price of a Snickers bar might go up, but it will never be the case that all the prices in the vending machine rise at the same time. There's neither inflation nor deflation. A stable dollar is the ideal. It gives us an intuitive standard against which to measure the prices of everything else. Only by first understanding that ideal can we start to understand the implications of deviating from that ideal. For this reason, I find it useful to assume that the dollar is stable. Inflation is always zero. In our vending machine economy, the average price of a candy bar can't change. This might feel like I'm cheating. If we assume away inflation, then we won't be able to answer important questions, such as whether basic income causes inflation, right? Wrong. Because by assuming zero inflation, we're also assuming the conditions that are necessary to maintain zero inflation. Sorry, Bethany, you got to keep yourself muted. For this reason, blah, 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 blah. Because by, all right, this might feel like I'm cheating. If we assume away inflation, then we won't be able to answer important questions, such as whether basic income causes inflation, right? Wrong. Because by assuming zero inflation, we also assume conditions that are necessary to maintain zero inflation. By disallowing inflation, we're disallowing the causes of inflation. For example, let's say that the vending machine will automatically adjust its prices to sell all of its candy bars every day at the highest possible price. The implication is that there's now only one level of basic income that's even possible, the natural level of basic income. At the natural level of basic income, the same number of dollars flowing into the vending machine always corresponds to the same number of candy bars flowing out to consumers. The average price of goods and services remains constant. There is no inflation. Now, imagine we get a bigger vending machine that can hold more candy bars. The economy's capacity to produce goods and services has expanded. That means that not only can we increase the basic income, we must increase the basic income to keep it at its natural level. Deflation is forbidden. The flow of consumer spending must continue to match the flow of economic output. If the economy is producing more goods and services for consumers, then consumers must be spending more money to purchase those additional goods and services. A change in the flow of candy bars implies a commensurate change in the flow of dollars. The flow of dollars and the flow of candy bars must remain equal and opposite. So far, our vending machine is fairly magical. It takes no inputs, it only produces output, it restocks itself every morning, and nobody really has to do anything. Let's instead imagine that the machine requires some labor input in order to produce its candy bars. Before, people were just consumers. They were beneficiaries of the economic machine. But now we need at least some people to contribute their labor as workers, to act as inputs into the economic machine. We can do that by withholding enough basic income to provide an incentive for people to earn the money back through jobs. Based on their individual situations, some people might choose to work, while others might happily accept the lower level of basic income. What matters is that the right total amount of labor is being contributed to fully restock the vending machine every morning. Some consumers can now buy more candy bars than others, but that's okay. We're rewarding them for operating the machine for the benefit of everyone. Given that our economy requires labor, our real world economy, the natural level of basic income, or given that this example economy, the natural level of basic income is the level of basic income that's low enough to activate enough labor to fully stock the vending machine, while also being high enough to ensure that consumers can still buy all the candy bars. As the economy's needs for labor decreases, we need to withhold less and less money from consumers. To put it another way, automation of production causes our economy's natural level of basic income to rise. The less we have to work, the richer we can be. This is great. It means that we don't always have to be workers. Workers are just inputs to the economic machine. People are more than just inputs. And when we think about people as workers, we're treating them as inputs. The economy is here to serve us, not the other way around. What matters is what we can get out of the economic machine. Everything else is secondary to that. The economy exists for the benefit of the people. The most important role that people play in the economy is the role of consumer, not worker. Being consumers just means we're receiving benefit from the economy. We're here to eat the candy bars. We only need to participate in making the candy bars to the extent that they won't otherwise get made. One of my favorite Adam Smith quotes says, "Consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production. And the interest of the producer ought to be attended to only so far as it may be necessary for promoting that of the consumer." That's exactly right. All he meant is that without someone to consume the products, there's no point in having any products. We only need to reward workers to the extent that it gives them an incentive to contribute useful labor. So the government prints the money and consumers spend it into the vending machine. But where does the money go? If we want, we can try to tell a story about how the vending machine is paying its workers using candy bar money, but there's still a gap. Consumers spend far more money on candy bars than workers receive in wages. Where does the rest of the money go? The answer is simple. Money accumulates. It doesn't just keep circulating forever. Money flows from consumers to producers, while goods and services flow in the opposite direction. The producers are happy to accumulate money because they like getting rich. Meanwhile, consumers must continually have their money replenished through the basic income. If we pull back the curtain and look inside the vending machine, we can see that it's made up of lots of parts working together. It's the workers and their labor, it's the capitalists and their equipment, it's the resources and materials, it's the automated production processes. All of these various factors churn away to produce goods and services for our economy's consumers. We could certainly imagine a world in which everyone's a worker and everyone consumes exactly in proportion to what they produce. In this world, each worker produces something, gets paid for it, and buys stuff from other workers. Naturally, those who contribute more labor are the ones who are able to consume more goods and services. In this world, dollars merely serve as a medium of exchange that facilitates trade and allows people to benefit from the fruits of each other's respective labor. Unfortunately, this world is impossible. The real world doesn't work that way. It can't. Perhaps there was a time in history when the market economy behaved more like a system of mutual exchange among workers. But with the Industrial Revolution, the idea that consumers and producers were the same people became largely a fiction. Industrialization caused the market economy to become less like a system of exchange among workers and more like a system of distribution from producers to consumers. More like, wait for it, a giant vending machine. The possibility of accumulating money acts as an incentive for people to produce in excess of their consumption. People enjoy having the power to claim more goods and services than they'll ever actually claim. This is a feature, not a bug. Producers are motivated by profit to make more than they take. Meanwhile, the rest of us get to take more than we make. Collectively, consumers can access some amount of the economy's production without having to work for it. That's what basic income facilitates. At this point, a question might be nagging you. Actually, a lot of questions might be nagging you. But in particular, in the real world, we have a basic income of 0, but we also don't have deflation. In fact, we tend to see a low and steady level of inflation in consumer prices. Does that mean that the natural level of basic income for our economy is 0? No, it means we're compensating for lack of basic income in other ways. As I said at the beginning, we create jobs for people as an excuse to pay them. In an efficient labor market, jobs only exist because there's actually work that needs doing. And the only purpose of wages is to provide an incentive for people to perform that labor. But we don't have an efficient labor market. Instead, we have a culture of expecting people to work for a living. When we think about the health of the economy, we tend to frame it in terms of jobs. The economy is doing well when unemployment is low, wages are up, and the labor market is strong, right? Well, maybe, but only because we've rigged it so that people need jobs in order to earn a living. And this arrangement is holding us back from reaching our full potential. To the extent that we're creating jobs to push money to workers, we're not creating those jobs because there's actually work that needs doing. And this problem is becoming all the more obvious during the COVID-19 pandemic when we explicitly want people to stay home, but people depend on their jobs for income. Believe it or not, our economy is rife with private sector make work. Generally speaking, employers are not, out of the kindness of their hearts, going to hire workers when it's not profitable to do so. So what our government does is they use economic policy to make it profitable. Businesses that probably shouldn't even exist are able to borrow cheap money to hire workers. It's the whole economy. It's everywhere. It's big businesses, it's small businesses, it's restaurants, farms, etc., that would otherwise wouldn't exist without supportive monetary policies, tariffs, and subsidies, etc. We do some crazy stuff to protect American jobs and keep people employed, not to mention the military. We've got whole branches of economics that study this stuff and try to figure out how we can optimize the economy for getting as close as possible to full employment. But what economists are forgetting is that full employment is not the same thing as full output. Ideally, what we want to do is maximize what we're getting out of the economy rather than what we're putting into it. Full employment just means we're keeping everyone needlessly busy. By forcing everyone to earn a living through a job, we're wasting people's time, we're wasting resources, and we're damaging the environment. Just take a look at what happened to pollution levels when the government forced everyone to stay home. Jobs are bad for the environment. Jobs come with all kinds of costs. They're only worth it if the benefit they produced exceeds their costs. And it's not a per job thing either. You can't point to a particular job and identify it as a make work job. It's the whole labor market that's suffused with make work. Pretty much every job is at least partially unnecessary. We can't know which jobs are useful until we calibrate the basic income to its natural level and achieve an efficient labor market. At that point, we can take a look around to see which jobs are still standing. Those are the useful ones. At the end of the day, some people still can't find jobs, especially now. But people don't need the jobs to begin with. They need the money from the jobs. Handing people money is way easier than trying to tweak economic conditions to make it profitable to hire everyone into useless jobs. It gets worse. As I mentioned, one of the biggest ways we generate this make work is through monetary policy. The Fed is responsible for keeping the general price level stable. It's their job to ensure that the average price of metaphorical candy bars stays the same. The Fed's monetary policy manages consumer spending by encouraging or discouraging borrowing in the financial sector. When the Fed discourages borrowing, it's called monetary tightening. When they encourage borrowing, it's called monetary stimulus. This is essentially the government encouraging more private sector money printing. But the distribution of the new borrowing is uneven. The Fed can't control that part of it. It's because the people who are able to borrow the most money are the ones who already have the most money. When fewer people have more money to spend, it becomes more profitable for firms to produce fewer goods and services at higher prices. In other words, to keep prices up, monetary stimulus makes it profitable for the vending machine only to partially restock itself every day. The Fed can always achieve zero deflation using this method, but the economy will underproduce. People will be forced to do unproductive work, and consumers will lack sufficient money to buy all the candy bars the economy would otherwise be able to provide them. People are overworked and needlessly poor. There's another problem too. In order for the economy to keep churning along, people and firms have to continue borrowing more and more money. This process is not sustainable. It creates instability in the financial sector. New debt continues to stack on top of old debt, and the financial system grows increasingly brittle over time. Eventually, the bubble pops and it all comes crashing down. And then we do it all over again. Even during boom times, some people are left behind. We have the resources to provide a better standing of living, but those resources are not being properly activated. I've just described for you the status quo. Our economy has looked like this for a while. We are continually subjecting ourselves to a cycle of booms and busts without ever reaching our full potential. Economists call this the business cycle, and they generally accept it as an unavoidable natural feature of the economy. It is not. These problems are caused by the absence of an efficient mechanism to get spending money to consumers. These problems are caused by lack of basic income. Basic income is commonly associated with an amount of money that ensures some predetermined minimum standard of living. But if we want consumers to reap the full benefit of what the economy has to offer, and if we want to prevent future recessions, this is not enough. That's why I advocate what I call a calibrated basic income, in which we feel out the economy's natural level of basic income by starting at a modest amount and gradually increasing it. Remember that inflation is not allowed. That means that as the basic income increases, the Fed tightens its monetary policy and reins in the financial sector to a sustainable level. No more boom and bust cycle of recessions. My friends often accuse me of prescribing basic income as the solution to all the world's problems. It's not. There are important problems that basic income does not solve. But the way we get people their money is broken, and basic income fixes that. This is a big deal. I don't know how many of our societies are caused or exacerbated by lack of basic income. but I'm sure it's a lot. If there's one thing that basic income supporters universally understand, it's that our economy can be doing better for its people. Political movements are great, but my hope is to make basic income so obvious to everyone that we don't even need to fight for it. Let's get started. All right, so that's it. We can move on to questions. Yeah, Bethany, go ahead.
Oh, that was me clapping.
Oh, that's you clap. Oh, that's a clap, not a raised hand. Okay. Yeah, Mom, go ahead. Yeah, I see you. I just clicked unmute on, or wait a minute. Can you not unmute yourself?
Yeah, I did.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Yeah. One of my first questions has to do with the vending machine, which I think is a great metaphor for how the economy works. Simplified enough for, I think, for me to understand somewhat. But one aspect of that you didn't talk about was who stocks it, supply and demand chains. I mean, which now, we've all become aware of that. And, so those candy bars are made by somebody and stocked by somebody. So there's labor that's already built into that. I guess you would call those essential workers, maybe, to use the terminology that's being used now.
Yeah, if the candy bars are essential, then the people who produce the candy bars are essential workers for sure. Yeah, so I didn't talk a lot about, specific supply and demand relationships and stuff like that. But when we introduced labor, I talked about how the vending machine requires a certain amount of work. So you've got to lower the basic income to provide an incentive for people actually to contribute their labor to the economy. And also inside the vending machine, like when we pulled back the curtain, we saw, the capitalists were in there and the various other resources and all of that. All of those people are responding to incentives, right? All of that is, people are that activity is, kind of profit-seeking activity. They're doing it because they get something out of it. So the incentives have to be right in the economy in order for everything to get produced.
Just one more part to that question, and that has to do with what we're seeing now, that things are stripped away in a sense that what comes back in the economy, you could argue that this is a perfect scenario for basic income, because we're seeing now things fall away that may have been make work or may not have been contributing, productively, or, we're just kind of back to the core of what's essential, and building out from that, which seems like a great moment for using basic income.
Yeah, I think that's right. I like to say that basic income is a necessary piece of infrastructure in a healthy economy. And if we have something like the COVID-19 crisis come along and our people are sick, if our economy is sick, then that just makes the problem worse, right? Because a lot of people lose their jobs, and if they're depending on that for their incomes, then they're still not going to be able to buy the things that the economy still can produce for them. And then like, obviously, when I see jobs getting eliminated, I'm kind of like secretly celebrating all the time. But when I see this, part of my hope is that maybe a lot of these jobs don't come back and don't need to come back, and we find better ways of where we do basic income or something like that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, Anna, go ahead.
So I really like this idea, and I'm gonna come at it from a very cynical perspective. But the stimulus package that just happened didn't reach a lot of the people who needed it most. So there's like this wonderful idea of universal basic income, getting it out to everyone, but how do you actually get the income out to everyone without like all of the middle people who take a cut or some other heinous thing?
Yeah, so every layer of complexity that you add to the program is going to filter out some people who really do need the benefit. It's going to cause some people who qualify for it or need it not to get it. And that's bad. And I guess a good analogy is like voter IDs, right? So we want everyone to be able to vote, And a voter ID might seem like a very simple thing, like, oh, just prove that you're a citizen or whatever. Not a big deal to a lot of the people who spend their time making decisions about this kind of thing. But it is a big deal to other people, or maybe it's not a big deal to them, but also voting is not a big deal to them. Hold on. Guys, try to keep yourself muted when you're not raising your hand or talking. So yeah, voting isn't a big deal to them, and they're not gonna put in the effort to get that figured out, or maybe they really want to and they just can't, or something like that. So tiny little obstacles can really make a big difference in the total effect of something. So basic income, still has some obstacles. There's, how do you distribute, how do you identify all the people, but it removes kind of as many of them as you can, at least in terms of how it's designed, right? And then obviously we'd want to go further and figure out, efficient distribution mechanisms, how to identify everyone and make sure they get their money, that kind of thing. Yeah. Fred, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So, so much to intake. That was great. Can you repeat the last little portion where you said something in regards to making basic income so incredibly obvious that it's a no-brainer or something to that effect?
Oh yeah. So yeah, I mean, I guess I don't even need to read that part, but I want. So I tend to approach basic income from more of an intellectual side than kind of a political activism side. And my hope is to get people thinking about basic income and thinking about how the economy works. And then once they understand that the economy, wait a minute, the economy is really like a giant vending machine, and it's a lot of it is about giving consumers money so they can buy the stuff from the vending machine. This is actually a new metaphor that I just came up with for this talk, but it's kind of how I think about it. Once people kind of understand how the economy works, then they'll understand that basic income is obvious, that the economy can't really work properly without a basic income, that it's a fundamental piece of economic infrastructure that we happen to be missing. Does that make sense?
It does. The last portion of it does, but unfortunately you were muted for like most of what you were saying.
I was muted?
I heard you.
Or it wasn't coming through. Maybe I'm the only one. Did anybody else hear him on? I would say the first
I heard him.
2/3.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess, yeah, I think it was just on your end, but just to kind of reiterate, I approach basic income from a more intellectual direction. And my hope is that, it's not, just make it obvious so that, when people understand how the economy works, then they'll understand that basic income is, fundamental to it.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So I have a couple more questions. We've heard it said that 74% of Americans can't afford an unexpected $500 bill. However, whether you're part of the 74% or if you're part of the 26%, it seems like the whole 100% is making their argument for universal basic income based off the fact that poor people can't, they're not going to have their basic needs met without universal basic income.
Yeah.
So I like to, you're hearing a lot of?
Yeah, so I like to think about it kind of from the opposite angle. So if a properly functioning economy has a basic income at its natural level, then what happens when you remove that? What kinds of problems does that cause? And poverty is one of those problems. So when I think about the problem that basic income solves, it solves the problem of how to get spending money to consumers, which is necessary for a properly functioning market economy. And then if you don't have that, then it leads to all these other things, including poverty, including people being desperate to work and being overworked and unemployment. If we are worried when jobs are eliminated, or we're worried when people aren't working as much, then that's a sign that there's something wrong with how we think about our economy, or something wrong with how we've set up our economy, because we've set up our economy for people to get income from jobs. Yeah. Let's go to Derek.
Hey, thanks. one of the most interesting things to me about your theory is the idea of basic income as a kind of counter-recessionary policy and actually ending what some people refer to as the business cycle. You talked about how monetary policy currently stacks new debt on top of old debt. Can you talk about what about that process makes it unsustainable? And then how does basic income fix that problem?
Yeah, so if you're funding the economy through borrowing in the private financial sector, then you've got all these different institutions and firms and everything borrowing money from each other. And then you've got in the financial sector, a lot of times it's an intermediary and you're borrowing in order to lend, and there's lending that's being funded by other borrowing. And then you've got this whole like layer of speculators who come in and they start making bets on who's gonna be able to make good on their debt and stuff like that, and that causes asset prices to spike and that kind of thing. So the idea is that like you need investment in the economy, you need a financial sector, but ideally you'd want the financial sector to be investing in real productive capacity, but people aren't going to start building out real productive capacity unless there's consumers who are going to buy the actual real goods and services, right? So what ends up happening is they kind of invest in themselves in the financial sector. You've got all these derivative bets and derivative investments and stuff like that, and it just kind of explodes. Now, when if all of these, if in order to lend, if I'm borrowing in order to lend, and I need to make sure that all my payments come due, all the people who owe me need to pay me back in order for me to pay the next guy. If that's true, and then someone defaults, and then I can't pay the next guy, right? So if the debts become interlocking enough, then you just knock over one domino and all the dominoes come falling down. And that's what you see in like 2008. So basically what we're doing most of the time is we're stacking up the dominoes. And we're doing it as kind of a substitute for how for a direct way of funding consumer spending through basic income. Because consumers don't have a basic income, the only way to keep prices from going deflationary, like in the Great Depression, is to encourage more and more and more borrowing in the financial sector. And we do this because we're afraid to print money, which, like I keep saying print money in the talk, but print money is like, maybe that means a lot more deficit spending, and governments are afraid to do that, right? So in order to prevent that, instead of printing money directly, they force the private sector to print the money, which is not stable. So either your money is going to be backed by government debt, essentially. If the government's just spending the money into the economy, you can think of that as being backed by government debt, or it's going to be backed by unstable private debt that has the cycle of collapsing, because we keep having to stimulate it, and then it collapses, and then we kind of bail it out or whatever, and then maybe some of that debt doesn't have to get paid back, and that's kind of how money keeps growing and stuff like that. But if we just did it directly, then we could rein in the private financial sector. We wouldn't have to rely on the financial sector for providing consumer incomes, for creating jobs, supporting businesses and stuff like that. We could just allow the businesses that are profitable in actually producing things for consumers to survive, and let all the other jobs go away, all the other businesses go away, that kind of thing. Bethany, go ahead.
I just wanted to possibly clarify something that came up a little while ago, because we're all used to thinking about like essential work right now, but I think your definition is a little bit different. So I think your definition is broader. Right now, we're kind of limiting it to things that absolutely we need for survival, whereas I think you would claim that even if you include all the things we enjoy, like going to restaurants and shows and travel and stuff, there are still kind of maybe unnecessary jobs above and beyond even that kind of enjoyment productivity. So I just wanted to clarify the difference between how we think about essential like right now versus how you think about productive. Maybe you can speak to that.
Right. So for me, it's the difference between you're creating a job because you want the output of the labor, and you're creating the job because you want to push money to workers or provide a benefit to workers or something like that. And at the level of the individual firm, you're always creating the job because you want that labor for whatever your firm is doing. But then the government, the Fed, sets up monetary policy that makes businesses that might not otherwise be viable because they want to promote full employment. And actually, they don't really target full employment. They're trying to target the price level, but this is the effect that it has. They do have a mandate to target full employment, but they generally focus on the price level. And then they start telling all these stories about how they correspond with each other. And they do, of course, if you're living in an economy where people's incomes come from wages, where people are dependent on jobs for their incomes. But if you have a basic income, then full employment, price level, there's not really a connection there. Soraya, go ahead.
Hey everyone. All right. So again, yeah, I'm a social worker and not an economist. I don't know, it's just like your explanation of it seems like too focused on like consumerism. Like what is, when you're saying like because you said like, oh, like the first thing you said was like there's unnecessary jobs. And then, the point of this is so that people can go buy stuff. But it's like, well, what's the point of the basic income? Shouldn't it be for like housing, food, like, what you need? But this kind of seems more, it's about like spending and then luxuries. So then wouldn't people still need jobs because they need like, or is everyone just supposed to live outside? You know what I mean? So like, seriously, like, because it's like, okay, if you're saying people should just be able to live off of this basic income, then wouldn't we still need subsidies? Wouldn't we still need like food stamps and stuff? You know what I mean? Like, I guess that's what is confusing to me, or at least like, from my standpoint, it doesn't seem like the proper step to help our society.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So, Jacqueline, hold on. If you want to, Jacqueline, if you want to speak, go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll call on you. Thank you. So that's a really interesting question. So there are important things that the government needs to be doing for the people, and they need to be putting resources into that. And that can include, universal healthcare. It can include, all kinds of things that the market won't provide on its own. Basic income is for funding the market. Now, it happens that there are certain things that the market is not providing people right now that it would be providing people if people had money to spend. So maybe food is one of those things. Like if you have money, you're not going to not buy food for yourself most of the time, unless there's something like, really, really going on with you. But the idea for basic income isn't that it's enough to survive. The idea with basic income, if you bring it up to, the question is how much basic income can the economy sustain? So the idea is to fund all of people's spending, and not just luxuries, not just basics, just anything you would buy out in the economy. Now, the question of whether you would need food stamps, my guess is if you imagined that we lived in a world that didn't have the resources to feed everyone, this is not the world we lived in, but if you imagine that we lived in that world, then maybe you could ration out the food so everyone gets like 2/3 of what they need or something like that, and you could do that using something like food stamps. But we have the resources to feed the world. We have the food to feed everybody, right? And if people have the money to buy it, they can buy it, and that's fine. You brought up the housing market, which is interesting, and it's something I talk about a lot because homelessness is a real problem, and not just homelessness is a real problem, but exorbitant housing prices going up and up and up, and people barely being able to scrape by with their rent and that kind of thing. It's not good, and we can ask what's causing housing to be so broken. And I would argue that a big part of it is that the housing market is very intertwined with the labor market. So you have to live near where the jobs are. If you provide people a basic income, that means a higher proportion of their income is independent of location. It's independent of job and therefore independent of location. This gives people more freedom to choose different places to live, and ultimately takes pressure off housing prices. And then the other factor in housing prices is that people use housing as an investment. And then we have economic policies that are designed to prop up housing prices because that's everyone's savings, right, is in their house. So if you have a basic income, then maybe there'd be less need for that too. Because I think, ultimately what we want, houses are places for people to live. We want people to be able to live in them. And we're kind of using them for this other thing. But if we have a basic income, then it allows us to maybe stop worrying about maintaining housing prices. And then we can allow housing prices to come way, way down. That sounds great if you're someone who's looking for a place to live. So I think that's a benefit of basic income as well. It doesn't really fit into kind of like the model I was talking about in my talk, but it is like when I mentioned that there's a lot of problems are caused by by the fact that we don't have basic income. I think the housing problem is one of them. And I think, if I'm confident that our economy can sustain a high enough basic income that we would not have homelessness anymore, and we would not have hunger anymore. Yeah, and something like healthcare, I don't think you can just leave that to the market. I think that's something that that the government, or at least some parts of it, the government has to provide directly, because there are incentive effects with insurance and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that explanation. I guess, my still concern is, part of the reason why I enjoy living in America, like my family's not from here. And it's because there is choice, you know what I mean? As opposed to like some other societies and economies where they're like, no, I'm not going to go all the way to like say Korea, but you know what I mean? Like there's lack of choice, lack of information, lack of, innovation, because it's so baseline and just like everyone just gets the same amount. But then, there could be corruption and all that other stuff. So I don't know, like, I'm listening, I'm learning, I'm not an economist or anything. So I'm hearing this, but like, more from a social standpoint, I would have thought this conversation would have been more about like basic housing and universal health care and like, those type of things. Because again, like I work with refugees and immigrants, I work with, underemployed people, and everything is about teaching them how to manage their money better, teaching them what necessities are versus luxuries. And, this conversation seems more about pushing people to spend so they can buy like a flat screen TV or like, so they can get that like nice car or something, as opposed to making sure that your basic needs are met. Again, that's my opinion. You don't have to answer everything, but I know Jacqueline was trying to talk. I don't know if you want to just give a quick tutorial on how to raise your hand on this.
No, she has her hand raised now. I'll call on her next.
Sweet. Okay. Well, thank you guys. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, Soraya. I think it's not about getting people to spend. Basic income is not about getting people to spend. It's about giving people access to the resources that the economy can provide for them. So when you give them money, you're giving them these tickets that they can use to claim things from the economy. I'm not trying to get them to buy big screen TVs. We're not like trying to encourage more resource usage or something like that. It's about giving them access to what the economy can already provide for them. And if there are people who are, spending money in ways that are harmful to themselves, I wouldn't want to encourage that. But I think it's generally true that when you give people money, they're better off than they were before you gave them the money. Like giving people money makes them better off. There are certain things like when people win the lottery and they end up losing it all and ending up being worse off and that kind of thing. But generally speaking, when people have more money, they're better off. So let's go to Jackie.
Jacqueline,
yep.
Thank you. I just wanted to raise a point. I'm going to wager a guess that I'm probably the only poor person in this room who's ever had experience with having to be on food stamps. So let me tell you how
I've been on food stamps. Thank you.
Let me tell you how that
continue.
is. Going through COVID as somebody who's disabled and not getting SSI. Okay. Let me tell you how that has panned out. I'm unable to use my food stamps to buy food. I'm under quarantine. I'm diabetic, immune compromised. I live, in a rural area, don't have a car, and yet I'm unable to use those food stamps to buy food the same way that I would if I had money, because the only option available to me, and this is the problem, not just in Erie County, PA, where I live, this is in many different localities across the country, where the only way you have of getting groceries is Instacart or some other equal grocery delivery service, or curbside express, which require you to order your food online and then pay with either a debit card or credit card that's, from your checking account, right? Or you have to go into the store physically. Now, obviously that's not an option.
So Jacqueline, I'm going to interrupt you. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the contents of the talk or about the theory of basic income.
I just had an issue with, I just feel, I get a little upset when people who are not, suffering because these so-called helpful means tested programs are anything but helpful. I have to beg throw myself at the mercy of the public just to get money to buy food because I'm sitting on.
Jacqueline, I'm gonna interrupt you again. I don't think anyone here is
advocating.
advocating means tested programs per se. Or are you speaking to Soraya, or what are you
Yes.
responding to?
I mean, my God, I would gladly say, hey, take the stupid food stamps that I'm unable to use to buy food that I need. By the way, not just any food. I'm diabetic and I'm a Crohn's patient. Okay. So there's medical issues at stake here too, but I'd rather have an income, that I can choose for my own. Just because somebody's poor, that doesn't mean they're stupid, and it doesn't mean they're irresponsible, and it bloody well doesn't mean they're going to go out and buy what did she say, an Xbox or a TV? Yeah, that's all this country needs is more boob tubes.
Yeah. I feel personally
go ahead,
attacked.
Soraya.
Jacqueline, I'm sorry you don't know me. I'm a type 1 diabetic. Here are my insulins. I'm on Medicare. I also receive food stamps because I work in the public sector. I work with refugees and immigrants in a nonprofit. Okay, so when I brought up my opinion, I see it from my perspective and my history of working with people and seeing that just giving them money with no other foundation, no other explanation about how to manage a bank account, how to save money, how to invest, how to ensure that you're rationing your supplies. That's the problem.
That sounds very paternalistic. Okay.
Okay.
No,
so I'm gonna.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, this doesn't have to be a one-on-one conversation. My point originally was the fact that the universal basic income, what I was hearing from Alex, seemed more about accessing luxuries instead of basic needs. So that's how I was coming at it, to ask, not say that that's what people are going to do, to ask, how do we encourage to make sure that housing prices are fair and equitable to everyone? How to ensure that access to food, just like you're saying, it doesn't make sense that you can't use your food stamps and that, you can't go to a grocery store.
It's a garbage program. It's a garbage program.
But that's what I'm saying. So that was my question. My question wasn't saying, oh, we still need SNAP. I was saying,
well, why did you bring up about we have to make sure poor people
Okay,
don't
I'm
spend?
gonna
I never said the word poor people.
This
I've never said
conversation
that
right
word.
now. Okay, so I think sorry guys. Also, I want to remind everyone that this is all being recorded and people are going to be able to watch this on YouTube forever. So just keep that in mind as we continue the discussion. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm when I'm talking about basic income and when I'm talking about consuming and consumers and stuff like that, it's not about luxuries. It's about everything. It's about whatever you would buy in the economy. So I'm not trying to, I don't think basic income, is specifically about luxuries. It's about whatever you want to buy with your money. And if someone's spending irresponsibly, then you might want to help that person. Okay, let's go to Mitchell. You there, Mitchell?
Hey,
wait.
I was wondering, what book would you recommend for people starting out with a basic income?
Yeah, I have a really hard time recommending books because they all say things I disagree with them. I disagree with in them. I really I like Philippe von Parijs. He's kind of the guy who I first heard the term basic income from. There was a book called Redesigning Distribution, edited by Eric Olin Wright in 2004, and it had different chapters on different income schemes. And the first chapter was on basic income, and it was written by Philippe von Parijs. There's also a great Boston Review forum from the year 2000, which was also it's Philippe von Parijs again. But then we've got a bunch of different experts like economists and stuff who are responding to him, and then he kind of responds back, and that's a great piece as well. His latest book with Philip Vandervoort is called I think it's just called Basic Income, and that's pretty good. I'm also working on a book because I'm not happy with all the books out there, but that's not out yet. Yeah. Let's go to Fred. Do you have another question? Your hand's still up.
Yeah, so I'd like to get your thoughts on a few things and ask a question too. So if I'm correct, you're saying that the market that you would inject basic income and the amount of jobs necessary would snap back how much the adjustment of the amount of basic income? Am I correct in saying that? And then when I'm used to hearing of basic income, I'm used to hearing a specific amount and then a value added tax because the common objection is how we're gonna how am I gonna pay for it? How are we gonna pay for it? So could you talk about those two things? And then before you do that, I was talking about the 74%, and I think that the 74% that can't pay an unexpected.
So Fred, your audio is breaking up a little bit. The first part of what you said, you were talking about basic income causing people to quit their jobs, I think. And I think basically, as you increase the basic income, it decreases the incentive to go out and earn money from a job. So generally, people are going to prefer to spend their time doing what they ordinarily do. And I've said this before, that most of the work that people do, most of the work that we do as humans is not paid. Most of the most important work that we do is not paid. We just do it in our lives. And the labor market is for when we want to pay people to do something different with their time. So that's why we have jobs. But we've kind of co-opted the labor market and transformed it into a tool for funneling money to consumers. And the result of that is because we're creating jobs to push money to consumers, those jobs don't exist. It's not because we want the product of the labor. So this ends up being kind of like the private sector make work I was talking about.
My question was about, I'm used to hearing from people, how are you going to pay for it? And then basic income being set up on a specific amount, and then a value added tax being administered that would cover that amount. So it seems as if, and I came in late, it seems as if your model has to do with the amount of real jobs that are put into, or jobs that are put into the market that are fake just to create wealth to inject money into the market. Is that correct?
Yeah, kind of. So the VAT, pairing the basic income with the VAT is kind of the Andrew Yang plan. I'm generally not, I'm not a fan of that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you missed the beginning of the talk, but at the beginning of the talk, I said that there's only one way to pay for a basic income, and it's by printing money. And it's a matter of whether the economy has room for the spending, whether there's stuff for people to buy with the money. And if there is, then great, they can buy the stuff. And if there isn't, then taking money away from another part of the economy isn't going to create room for that additional spending, because there has to be the real resources there where you're putting the money. So for a VAT,
how is the inflection? Because you were talking about in the middle, you were talking about there's an inflection of like how much basic income would be coming to everyday people, all Americans.
Sure.
And that might fluctuate. How is that antiquated or figured out?
Right. So the question is, how much basic income can the economy handle? How much consumer spending can the economy handle? And that's determined by how much stuff the economy can produce. So as we get more productive, you would expect the economy to be able to handle more and more consumer spending. And in terms of how it's calculated, what I typically advocate is feeling it out. So start the basic income at some modest level, like $1,000 or something a month, and then gradually increase it. If you get to a point where you're increasing the basic income and then it's pushing interest rates higher than you want them to go, and really actually, you've already eliminated all of the unproductive investment in the financial sector, and now it's harder for just normal companies to borrow it for actually, productive investment, then maybe you stop there. Or if you notice that you increase the basic income, but then the level of economic output is not increasing anymore, then you're kind of reaching the limit of what the economy can do. There's a maximum. Does
that mean the basic income is determined by the Fed? Who would the amount?
I guess I didn't talk about who it would be determined by. I think in an ideal world, you'd have kind of a separate basic income authority that that adjusts the basic income, and as the economy gets more productive, it increases the amount, that kind of thing. And then the Fed would automatically kind of tighten monetary policy in response, because they no longer have to use monetary stimulus to prop up consumer spending because we're funding it directly.
Thank you for your answers. Your points are a little bit new to me, and they're pretty interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Richard, go ahead.
How do you think that basic income will affect the future of human societal development with things like optimal free ridership, economic versus human value, and things like that?
Yeah, so obviously I think humanity is really being held back from reaching our full potential because we don't have a basic income. We're forcing people to go out and spend their time in useless ways in order to earn money. Most of the important innovations in human history have been born of effort that nobody ever would have thought to pay for. You can't, and we can't just go out there and try to look at people and say, oh, this person is doing something productive and useful, this person isn't. I played, for 6 months there, the only thing I was doing with my time was playing World of Warcraft. I was hardly even sleeping, but I had some interesting thoughts during that time. And if I hadn't done that, I don't know, would I be here today? I don't know. But if someone had come in and prevented me from doing that, maybe I wouldn't have given this talk today. Who knows, right? So you can't really look at how people spend their time and be able to kind of pass judgment over it. I mean, you can to some extent, but I would say the only extent you'd want to do that is to the extent that you really, really need them to do something else with their time. Like you actually need certain work to be done. And then you wouldn't be going to a specific person saying, I need you to be working. You would say, I need someone to do this work. And then you'd offer enough money that someone comes along and offers to do it, and you'd have a negotiation, you have a market, right? But it's perfectly normal for in an efficient labor market for a lot of people just not to be working. We only need, we need the right total amount of labor to produce everything that's kind of needed in the economy. But there's no point in arbitrarily employing everyone, right? Like you don't go to a forest and say, hey, look at all these trees. I want to fully employ these trees, so let's chop them down and then figure out what to do with them. It's like, I want to build some things, I got to go chop down some trees. So that's kind of, it's the difference between thinking of people as workers and thinking of full employment as kind of the goal of economic policy, and then thinking of people, as consumers, that like we want to do what we can to maximize leisure, and we only want to force people to work doing something else if that's necessary, if we can show that that's necessary. And I would want to be very careful about going too far with that, like be very conservative in really deciding to make people work, right? Really know that it's going to be something that's worthwhile for the economy. So
Not
I think
just leisure,
once we
but
have
freedom, right? This is America.
Yeah, I mean, it is freedom, and when you give people freedom, sometimes they make decisions that you wouldn't make or that you don't like. But I think that's the price of freedom, and that's worth it. And it's only a problem if they're doing something that's harming other people or harming the society. So yeah, in terms of the future, I think as soon as we flip the switch on basic income, it doesn't even have to be a fully calibrated basic income or something like that. But when we flip that switch, it's going to make a huge difference in our society. And then I imagine that once we have a basic income, we'll make a lot more progress to figure out what the optimal level is and stuff like that. And it's just going to unlock a lot of human potential. Like if you think about ancient times, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, all of the important innovations were done by the tiny aristocracy, right? And they they survived. They were able to do it kind of on the backs of slaves, right? But if you have a basic income, then everyone can be kind of in that position where they have that freedom to think about what they want to think about and do what they want to do. And of course, there were plenty of people back then who, kind of squandered their time and they were rich and useless, just like there are today. But those people, we don't know about. They're not in the history books. But if everyone has an opportunity, if everyone has the freedom to reach their own potential to the extent that the economy can accommodate that, that's going to be huge for us. It's going to be transformational. Let's go to Ian.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Thanks for the talk. I agree wholeheartedly that giving people money is a good thing. I'm also a social worker, so it's good to see another social worker. I think, giving money is good. I think, there's always going to be people who, have self-destructive tendencies and will, make bad choices. In certain situations, I think that's just a given. But, I think the large majority, having more money is better than having less, especially if you're not able to pay for basic things. But my question is kind of related to what Soso brought up in terms of almost like kind of feeling like a socialist type of thing. Like how would UBI mesh with in a capitalist type of economy? Is it because people are still able to work as much as they want and still make money? And also, I know a big part of the theory is that spending needs to continue to take place to offset, I think, inflation maybe. But does this mean people would not be able to build wealth if a UBI was in place? Those are my two questions.
Yeah, so people can always save money. If a UBI is in place and the financial sector is kind of reined in a bit, then maybe you're going to see less making money off various financial investments and stuff like that. If you're investing, maybe you're investing in companies that are actually producing real goods and services for consumers, stuff like that. You're always going to be able to save. You might not be able to get as fabulously wealthy as you can now by kind of playing the stock market and financial markets and stuff like that. So that's true. As to socialism versus capitalism, so it's interesting because I guess people define capitalism in different ways, and I think Derek has some opinions on this. But it's often seen as capitalism is private ownership of the means of production, and socialism is kind of shared ownership or community ownership of the means of production. Basic income is concerned with the means of consumption. So when you're giving everyone money, you're giving everybody tickets so they can claim the output from the economy. So you're giving them access to the means of consumption. So it's kind of a little bit of an orthogonal thing. We can think about which kinds of things, which kinds of resources need to be allocated directly by the government, and then that's kind of more of a socialized thing, and then which kinds of resources are more efficiently allocated by the market, and that's more of kind of a capitalist market-oriented thing, and there's plenty of debate to be had there. And I think basic income is agnostic on kind of where you draw the line or what you put on the different sides of that line, but what it does do is it funds the market side of the line, wherever you choose to draw that line. So yeah, I don't think, basic income is certainly not incompatible with capitalism. I think in some ways it turns capitalism into socialism, in the sense that if everyone has access to the economy's output, then it's kind of like it's kind of like we're all owners of the whole economy, and we get to vote with our dollars about what it produces and stuff like that. So that's kind of like a form of ownership. So it might even kind of bring the two things together a little bit. Yeah. Bethany, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that people mean a lot of different things by words like capitalism, so it depends on what he means. But in terms of markets being efficient, like technically it enhances the ability for markets to be efficient, because it naturally, like you said, allows the labor market to be a market for labor, and potentially only a market for labor, instead of also like a bunch of other things. And it allows, like you said, the the way that capitalism or free markets, I'll just say, are supposed to be good for people is what you said, that people kind of get to vote from their dollars, and the goods that are produced are the goods that they want. But this, of course, only works for the benefit of people who have money. Like, that's the whole point. You use the money to get the things that you want. And so in a way, it allows you could imagine it allows those benefits to reach people more broadly, but it's actually could be part of thinking of that kind of system as working properly, or working for the benefits that it's supposed to work for.
Yeah, it was funny, like during the presidential debates, Elizabeth Warren would keep saying the economy only works for the people who have money. I'm like, well, if we have basic income, then that's everyone, right?
Right.
So yeah, so it kind of makes capitalism work for more people in some ways.
I wanted to say one more thing about language, because I think like the word consumer can have like very specific connotations for some people, like, oh, like we just overbuy things that don't make us happy, or we're like wasting resources. And I just wanted to make really explicit that your use of consumer is not that specific, or it's like it's not really aligned per se with those kinds of expectations, but rather any benefit you would get from the economy, which I know you've said before, but I think that's a common kind of association. And that the things people could be buying could be food, could be housing, could be an art class that they really love, could be doesn't have to be something we think of as like harmful for the environment or whatever people might be concerned about. Those are kind of like maybe in your model sort of separate issues to solve, or issues to solve with taxes or things like that.
Yeah, so I guess I use the word consumer and consumption the way economists do, which basically just means that the whole point of the economy is that it's producing stuff for people, producing goods and services, producing benefit for people, right? And then being a consumer just means you're receiving that benefit. You're receiving the benefit that the economy provides for people. And then there's also an important distinction to draw between consumption and resource usage, because consumption means you are consuming the output of the economy, and resource usage means we're putting resources into the economy. So this is actually similar to kind of like the full employment, full output thing, right? Full employment means you're using up as much of the resource of labor as possible. And full output means you're getting as much as you can out of the economy. And you can think about it the same way with other resources. So there's ways to have much, much higher consumption, much, much more benefit to people, while also having much lower resource usage and much less impact on the environment. So that's kind of something to keep in mind as well.
Thanks.
Mom, go ahead.
Oh, just to the point of capitalism again. There's nothing preventing anybody from amassing wealth as they're getting a basic income. I mean, Bill Gates will still get a basic income, for example. Everybody gets a basic income, it's universal. Then some people will choose to keep working their heads off and keep amassing more money. It's not a given that you'll leave your job. I mean, you may want to keep more, adding more money.
Yeah, and the more people want to do that, they want to keep working and amassing money, the more the rest of us get to free ride on that contribution. Yeah, which is fantastic. Let's go to David.
I wanted to clarify something from people who haven't listened to Alex speaking before. When he talks about consumers and he talks about people not working, he doesn't mean that people are not working. He means that they're not working in the labor market for money, which is very different than not working. And that's something that people kind of need to keep track of, is that, these people are still parents and caregivers. They're still working.
Yes, excellent point. Thank you for bringing that up. There's, the labor market is only for when we want to get people to do something different. Fred, do you have a question? Go ahead.
I guess that's it. That's all I really need to say for translating there, is that people, when he talks about consumers, he doesn't mean consumption like gratuitous consumption. In fact, his idea about this consumer monetary theory is allowing, and just printing the money, is allowing for an economy that doesn't rely on this exponential expansion in a finite world. And so if you have an ecological bent, or if you're concerned about the environment, you might want to look at, how do we prevent us from, extracting all of our resources? And this might be a way to get there.
Yeah. So, I talked briefly about, or during the Q&A, I mentioned briefly the, deciding which resources need to be allocated by the government or which resources are more efficiently allocated by the market. But you can also have a third category: which resources do we want to conserve, right? So maybe we could keep the basic income even lower, but also not have the monetary stimulus, so you don't have the unstable financial sector, right? Because they're actually comfortable with the economy producing less, and we're not worried about consumers not having jobs. So you could have a lower basic income and conserve some resources that way. So the government spends what it spends, the market uses the resources that it uses, and then there's resources that we're saving for later. And I think that's something that's important to keep in mind as well. Bethany, go ahead.
Just a related topic you often bring up, since we're talking about conserving resources, you can also use like targeted policies. In addition to the overall level of basic income, you can have targeted taxes to kind of direct spending towards things that might not use resources, away from things that use, a lot of resources, that kind of thing, or scarce resources, whatever.
Yeah, I didn't talk a lot about taxes in my talk, but one of the big things you can do with taxes is you can provide a disincentive to waste certain resources. So if someone's using up a lot of a resource that in some kind of business or something, and that resource could go towards consumer goods, but it's being kind of pulled over in this other direction, you can tax that particular use of the resource, free it up for consumers. Now you can have a higher basic income, or you can have more conservation or more resources freed up for the government. Yeah.
Alex, you said lowering the basic income to sort of go in tandem with conserving resources at the government level. Wouldn't it work more like the government passes a law that this resource is not allowed to be used by people, like, let's say, national parks or something, and then the basic income just calibrates to whatever level it calibrates at, and that'll be affected by conserving the resource, but it's not like directly related, right?
Yeah, so you could do it either way, right? You could directly legislate that something is not allowed, or you could tax the thing to reduce the amount of it that's happening, right? Either one would have kind of the same effect. Yeah. Richard, go ahead.
How do you think that the basic income would affect the environment, and how the governmental systems of the earth would develop, and would it lead to like scarcity and like warfare and things like that due to the scarcity, or would it lead to a unification and a lack of warfare?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the conflict that happens in the world is related to resource scarcity and poverty and that kind of stuff. If you're providing basic income to people, you're kind of creating conditions that are less conducive to conflict, right? Less conducive to people kind of forming their in-groups and competing with the out-group and that kind of thing. If you have a global basic income, then yeah, maybe that's would be a huge mitigating factor to war. If you have just a national basic income, maybe that's a huge mitigating factor to anti-immigration sentiment or racism or that kind of thing. Obviously, you can't change what's in people's minds, but you can change the conditions around them. You can make it at least less like you can do less forcing them into kind of a desperate situation where they start hating other people, that kind of thing. Yeah. In terms of how it affects the environment, yeah, I mean, like, I think we waste a lot of resources on jobs now. Jobs are, I said in the talk, jobs are bad for the environment. And if the more jobs we can eliminate, we see this right now, obviously, right, with COVID-19, all the skies are clearing up, all of that. If you don't have a rush hour, then that's a huge difference. Why do we need a rush hour? Why do we need people to commute to work every day? Like, we talk about jobs using up resources. One of the resources is the air, right? Like, I don't know, if we could find a way to build on what's happening now and kind of like, obviously there are some jobs we want back, or new kinds of jobs that are useful, but like, it would be great if we didn't have to bring back the jobs that only existed as a way of providing people income, right? That kind of thing. Mitchell, go ahead.
And your point on when you were saying the government print money, I know you've shared this before with other people, that the Professor Steve King on government surplus, that video is a good video to reference. It's a short 5-minute video.
Yeah, it's a Renegade short, Steve Keen. You guys can Google that. I'll type it into the chat. Steve Keen, Renegade shorts, government surplus. Whoops, I sent that to the wrong. There we go. So that's cool. He talks about why government surpluses don't make sense, because you kind of, I was talking about private sector money printing in the talk. And what Steve Keen says is that the economy essentially has two money factories. It has the government and then, the private financial sector. And if the government is producing less money, right, printing less money, then that means the private financial sector has to produce more. So when the government runs a surplus, that means they're sucking money in from the private sector, and then the private financial sector has to compensate for the lost money by increasing the lending. So that's kind of an interesting little video there. Bethany, go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could speak to the effect of basic income on kind of employee bargaining power, but I guess in the reverse, how the level of bargaining power relates to the level of basic income. So to try to be more clear, sorry about that. Obviously you were talking about how you need to lower the basic income enough to give people an incentive to work. But within that band where people have an incentive to work, they could have an incentive to work, but only at jobs that are like pretty fun, or like at least safe. There's kind of like different degrees to which they would have bargaining power in the job, also depending on the level of basic income. So I guess I'm curious if you could speak to how that affects how we would think about the level of that it should be at, if that question makes sense.
Yeah, I think you would calibrate the level to the place where the right amount of labor is actually being performed, and obviously by changing the incentives to work, by changing the need to earn money, that changes people's bargaining position. They might not accept a job, but you have to do more to get them to work. I don't think you would look at that as an indicator for when you've calibrated basic income to the right level. It's more about the economy being at the right level of labor. One thing that's interesting is that there are a lot of jobs in the economy that are very desirable, that people would love to do, but they can't do because the wages are so low. So I used to work in the video game industry, and if you worked there, you could have the same job as someone else somewhere else, and it would pay a lot less because people just really liked working on video games, right? So you could imagine those desirable jobs. You could imagine the wages going down with a basic income, and then the undesirable jobs that people are only doing because they're being forced to survive. Now they have an outside option. So now you might have to pay a lot more for garbage collectors or other kind of boring, like working at Walmart or Amazon warehouse or something like that, really boring stuff that people aren't interested in spending their time doing that, right? And I would also imagine that, you could imagine a world in which we don't really have a defined line between what's a job and what's not, right? Like right now we have volunteer work, which is like this admirable thing that everyone wants to support. But we also have a minimum wage, right? So if you're actually working at a job, you're not allowed to be paid below a certain amount, but then you're allowed to be paid zero if you're a volunteer. And you're allowed to be paid zero just kind of in your daily life for doing the work that you normally do. But there's this whole continuum of possibilities in between there that's kind of out of bounds right now. So you could imagine paying someone a very small amount of money to do something that they're really happy to do. Maybe they wouldn't have done it without being paid, but you're like, hey, come do this. I'll throw you a few bucks or something like that. And then you could have a lot more flexibility in the labor market. So it's less about what's a job and what's not. And just the idea of labor is that you're paying someone to do something or something like that.
Can I say a follow-up? I guess a related point is that I think you talk about different problems that happen when you don't have a basic income. And one problem on people's minds right now, I think a lot, is the issue of protecting workers. Like, how do you make sure that they're not exposed to health risks that don't make sense, or overworked, or all these different kinds of concerns that people have. And I guess I wonder if you could speak to how you think basic income does or doesn't address that issue of kind of worker protection, what we think of as worker protection in a way.
It's really interesting, right? Because there are really dangerous jobs, like being an astronaut, that you know, we don't say like, oh no, there's not enough worker protections or something like that, right? And that's because these are people who go in not only knowing the risks, but they also don't need to be doing it to survive. You know, they're choosing to do that. Whereas with people in maybe other types of dangerous jobs, you know, if they don't have that job, they don't have money, they can't survive, right? So that's where we tend to focus on these worker protection kind of things. I think, you know, with a basic income, there'd be less of that. I think there would certainly be strong enforcement of you have to be upfront about what the dangers are, that kind of thing. But if you admit that the job is dangerous, then you know, people can say no to it, or they can work it and it's dangerous and that's fine. You know, they didn't have to do that to survive. It's more like being an astronaut, right? And maybe you have to pay people a lot of money to do it too. Yeah, so I think that would kind of be the shift that we would see. You wouldn't be so worried about being paternalistic about workers, and maybe you wouldn't be thinking of people's identity as being a worker as much anymore. Like, people are people. It's not the fact that you contributed something to the economy that gives you value. You know, it's not the fact that you're an input to the machine that gives you value as a human being. Right.
So you're saying we shouldn't pay our astronauts?
I think if you can get the best astronauts and they're willing to do it for free, I don't think you should pay them, no.
But I guess just the effect you described would happen, the higher the basic income, the more you would see this effect of these kinds of
less paternalism on workers, and less of even thinking of people as workers, as like that's their identity, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Interesting. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah. Cullen, go ahead.
Hi there. Can you hear us?
Yep.
All right. Go ahead. Carly has a question
here.
here.
Carly, go ahead.
I just wanted to comment on the phrases useless jobs and make work, because I've had lots and lots of jobs, and I don't think any of them were useless, but they had periods of uselessness. So you're hired for 40 hours and your work runs out after 30, and then, you know, they don't want to send you home, so you start sweeping and whatever, and they make up stuff. So I think that is true. And the other thing that occurred to me through this whole talk was that we have a section of our economy that is just about making money with money, like lending it and charging interest. And that UBI is a terrible threat to that part of our economy, because they're already relying on people to need money, and they're inflating. Well, there's a kind of an inflation there with the interest rates. They're selling people money and charging them a lot of money for the money, you know, and I think that's a threat to basic income. That's just a comment I had.
Well, I agree with you that basic income is a threat to them. So I guess they're a threat to basic income too. Yeah, I like that comment. I think there are a lot of people whose jobs depend on society being broken. And Soraya and Ian, you know, like, maybe if people aren't struggling as much in their lives, then there won't be as many jobs for social workers. So that's another example. So bankers and social workers, investment bankers and social workers won't be able to make as much money if you have a basic income. I thought those were great points.
Social workers maybe aren't in it for the money. I wonder though.
Yeah, well, maybe they'll have less work to do, I guess. Yeah.
And I can comment. I like was it Carly?
Yeah. Go ahead,
yeah.
Sarah.
Like, I've never had a job where I only worked 30 hours and they had to find something to do for 10. No, I've only worked 40-hour jobs, which really needed 60 hours worth of work. But no, I'm really happy to be a part of this, because I'm hearing, I guess when I initially came into this, I was thinking that you guys' proposal was to have universal basic income in a vacuum. Like, that was it, no other social services. So being a part of this discussion, I'm like, okay, so you see the need, like, that doesn't solve everything, because it doesn't.
Of course not. Yeah.
Right, and that's why, initially coming into this, I was like, what? Like, no, like, oh, there's so many other factors. So my question is, what factors go into calculating a universal basic income? I get your analogy, getting candy bars. What is a candy bar? Please, break that down.
In terms of calculating the amount?
Yeah, so if we're gonna say it's $2,000 a month, how did you get to that number? What qualifies, what quantifies that it would be that? Is it housing? Is it food? Is it because, like you're saying, we still would need health insurance, we still would need food stamps, we still would need buses. So like, what else?
So I would never calculate it based on what people need. I'd calculate it based on the maximum that we can achieve. So the question, like, why would we want to stop at subsistence? Why would we want to stop at people's basic needs? And then the flip side of that is that if we can't achieve supporting people's basic needs, then you just can't do it if we don't have the resources to do it. But I think we have the resources to do it. I think we have the resources to go a lot further. And the question is, why don't we maximize what we can get out of the economy instead of just making sure it checks off a few minimum standard boxes or something like that?
But Alex, so the calculation is you raise it steadily and look for bad things or inflation happening, and then you stop raising it, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, you probably wouldn't get to the point where you actually see inflation. What you'd see is monetary tightening. As the financial sector shrinks, it's very rare for that kind of thing to happen smoothly. So you might even see some kind of deleveraging or instability in the financial market that's triggered by the basic income. But then once the basic income is kind of established, you're never really going to see that again. You'd see. I mean, what I would look at is I guess one of the big things is economic output. If you're increasing the basic income and people aren't actually able to buy more stuff, and you don't have inflation, then what's happening is that you're just perfectly substituting people's income that's being funded by the private sector with income that's being funded by the public sector. So you're exactly offsetting that spending, and it's the same amount of economic output. So then you're kind of getting to the point where if you tried to push it any further, you'd see inflation. But it's important to remember in the talk I said that each price level has a corresponding natural level of basic income. If you do push the basic income too far, it's not going to keep causing inflation. It's going to cause a period of inflation until that inflation brings the purchasing power of the basic income back down to the natural level the economy can sustain. So if you overshoot, it's just like prices go up and then they hit their new higher level, that kind of thing. What you can do if you really want to cause hyperinflation is you can index the basic income to inflation. So you can declare, I want everyone to be able to, own 7 Teslas or something like that. I'm going to calibrate the basic income to that level. And then people keep not being able to buy 7 Teslas, and then the prices just keep going up on everything. And then you just keep raising the basic income. That's hyperinflation, right? Hyperinflation happens when the government makes a commitment to do more than it can actually do, to do more than the economy can handle. So I'm generally not in favor of indexing anything to inflation because it runs that risk. And the more things you index to inflation, the more of your economy is committed to providing a certain amount of stuff, regardless of what it can actually provide. Yeah.
Sorry, follow up to that too.
Yes, right.
So, how do you account for, like, say it was $3,000, everyone gets $3,000, but
Sure.
you guys are in Boston, I'm in Ohio. It's
Right.
much cheaper to live here. You know what I mean? So it's just like, how do you account? Because like I was part of the discussion last week, how they did in Maricá, but that's one wicked small area as opposed to, the US that's so diverse, from Boston versus Newton or, whatever, Plymouth, you know what I mean? So how do you, in this proposal, how do you guys see that happening?
Yeah. So you said wicked small, but you're in Ohio.
I'm born and raised from Boston. Hell
okay,
yeah,
right.
Of course, which
Right.
is how I got involved with this. I actually just spent the last 6 months in Boston taking care of my grandmother, but I'm back home now. I'm a Buckeye now. So, but yeah, please.
Okay. It's an interesting point. Different locations have different costs of living, right? So a basic income is going to stretch a lot farther in, Akron, Ohio than it is in Boston, Massachusetts. You're just, especially with housing but even other stuff too, right? And that's generally going to be true. And I think that's a good thing. What it does is it allows people to move to cheaper areas. So it helps prices even out across and between regions in the economy. And this helps kind of bring the economy together, make the economy more consistent in different places. I think it would be a mistake to set the level of the basic income based on the cost of living in the particular area, like have it different in different areas, because now what you're doing is you're paying people to move to New York. And what's that going to do to prices in New York, right? That's going to drive up prices further. So I'd rather see prices even out in the economy. You might see some things get a little more expensive in cheaper areas, but I think since a lot of this is the housing market, and basic income gives people more flexibility to live in different places overall, I think you're going to see housing prices in general come down. I don't think there's going to be that many places where you see housing prices go up as a result of basic income. Yeah. Bethany, go ahead.
Yeah, so another thought that came to mind, kind of tangential to one that was raised before when talking about different kinds of services, and you've mentioned this, but it's actually its own interesting question, kind of which things are best handled by the market and which things aren't. So I think, Sarah, I mentioned like public transportation, healthcare versus maybe other kinds of things that you would just buy with flexible cash that you can allocate. So this becomes like part of the art of figuring out the level of the basic income too, is how many resources should be, what kinds of resources should be allocated by the government. And there's real thought that can go into that in terms of what's most efficiently handled in a centralized way versus a way where people get to make their own choices. I don't know if you want to speak to that at all, but it's another interesting question that seems to come up with like which services is it going to cover, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I have some opinions about which things, it makes sense for the government to provide. Obviously, I don't think it's a good idea to just hand people a bunch of money and expect them to build roads and bridges and interstates and stuff like that. I don't expect to hand people a bunch of money and expect them to, put the military together, right? I think these are things that the government should be responsible for. I do hope that with basic income in place, there's going to be less war and therefore less of a need for military. I also think we use the military largely as a jobs program as well. And if you had basic income, you wouldn't need to use the military for that purpose anymore. So you could maybe cut things back in certain areas, not having to, hire so many soldiers or military contractors, that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, like it's an interesting debate, and I think you can support basic income as long as you understand that at least there is a role for the market to do something,
Right.
and then the basic income funds that.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm sorry, real quick. So are you proposing a basic income for the entire world or just for the US?
I think ideally it would be the entire world. In my talk it was very abstract. I was kind of referring to America a couple times, but generally it's imagined that it would be at the level of the country. But I think we live in a global economy. It only makes sense that we would have a global currency and then a unified basic income. So maybe the people in Mexico would be able to spend a lot more with it than the people in the United States and the people in India, right? But then maybe you'd see a lot of people move to cheaper countries and areas, and I don't know. I have this kind of like ideal utopian vision of a one world basic income and open borders and all of that. But we don't have to go that far. Yeah, Valerie, go ahead.
Alex, I wonder if you need to lower people's hands.
Yeah. Hello.
Hey, Valerie, what's up? Yep.
Yes, hi. I just wanted to say, I would love for you to do a summary of what you had read for us before this hour is up, because we're just at 12 minutes to 9 p.m. your time.
Yep.
It's still sunny here in California.
Yeah, so the good news is that this is all being recorded. It's live streaming on YouTube right now, so you'll be able to watch it again later. I guess the main summary, to kind of like put it in a few words, which kind of like, if I can do that, then maybe I didn't need to talk for so long, is just that you can imagine the economy as a machine that's producing goods and services for consumers. And then you could say, hey, we can give people enough money to buy everything the economy can produce for them, but then nobody's going to work. So you just so you have this kind of basic income that gets people all the money, and then you just lower the basic income to provide an incentive for people to work and earn the money back, and then that's kind of the natural level of basic income for your economy. If you lower the basic income below that, so you already have all the labor you need, now we have to start substituting for basic income in other ways. We have to find other ways to provide income to consumers, or just let some stuff go unproduced, so that kind of thing. And we do a combination of both. But one of the big things we do is that when we lower the basic income below the kind of natural level for the economy, now it creates an incentive for people to go get jobs jobs and contribute labor when we don't really need them to contribute their labor. But we also support this, like we create jobs for people. So then, now you have a situation, if the basic income is too high, then not enough people are working. If the basic income is too low, now you have people doing useless work. So you want to find the optimal level of basic income. So that's, I guess, the Cliff Notes version of my talk.
And what would you say in 2 or 3 sentences to people who don't know, who don't understand basic income, and what I've heard most people respond right away is that'll cause inflation and people will stop working, the usual stuff. And I don't really know how to present it to them quickly without them losing attention, except for me saying you need to read Andrew Yang's second book.
Yeah, I guess that's putting a lot of work on their shoulders, huh?
No, well, I also said you can listen to it on Audible, and you get to hear his voice, which is strangely and wonderfully flat the whole time he reads it, because he's reading facts. And it's awesome, actually, to hear a flat narrator who's the author. So, yeah, just wondering what key points to convey.
So 1 or 2 sentences. I would ask that person, I would say, well, in order for the economy to work, people need money to spend, right? Should we really be creating unnecessary jobs as a way of getting the money? Or maybe look at the ways we're currently getting people money now and ask if that's most efficient. Should we really have a financial sector that's growing and growing and growing, and you have these asset bubbles? Like, what are the ways? Like, I think everybody knows, right, that consumers need spending money, that people need money to be able to buy things, to be able to participate in the economy as consumers. So the question isn't should we add a bunch to what's already happening? The question is the mechanism that we're using right now, is it the right mechanism, or are we kind of pushing money to people in kind of these hidden ways, like where a lot of people are afraid of handouts, but we're already handing out money to everyone. We're just hiding it behind the fact that we're handing out jobs. And if you say stuff like that, I don't know, maybe you can kind of speak to their concern about inefficiency, because if you're just wasting people's time and you that kind of thing, then that's something that people who are concerned about efficiency can speak to. But really, when you talk about inflation, like, this is why in my talk I said, we're only going to do things that aren't going to cause inflation. We're not allowed to do things that cause inflation. So then the question is, so here's another question you can ask. You can say, a lot of people ask, can we afford a basic income, or will a basic income cause inflation? So you can turn that around and you can ask, what level of basic income can we afford? What level of basic income can our economy sustain? Just kind of shift it around that way. Instead of can we do it, you can ask,
current level is 0.
Yeah, start with a level 0. Is a level 0 basic income optimal for the economy? Why is that level appropriate? What about a negative basic income? Why shouldn't people be paying $1,000 a month, right? So you can kind of loosen up people's minds that way. Why did it settle on 0 as the optimal number?
It seems to be well known that head taxes are bad, right? Yeah, Alex, you should lower everyone's hands so that they can re-raise them.
I'm kind of. Yeah. Well, I don't want to lower people's hands. People have their hand. Go ahead, Richard.
How would basic income promote equality between minorities and women and disabled people and whatnot? And would it promote, say, people there's this whole PETA sort of thing where animal rights are equal to human rights and things like that? Could it do anything with that?
I don't think it would do anything with animal rights unless you gave a basic income to the animals as well, or something. I don't know. It's a human thing. In terms of equality between different people, I said before that there are problems that basic income doesn't solve. Certainly, it makes people less dependent on people who are maybe not going to treat them well, right? So if you have a basic income, maybe you are not dependent on someone who treats you unfairly or something like that. You can say, okay, bye. I don't want to deal with you, right? A a lot of people are kind of stuck in certain social situations, certain relationships where they don't really have that option. So basic income helps with that. And in terms of equality, I mean, equality is a difficult thing. Certainly, the basic income itself treats everyone equally. It doesn't. It's not like an affirmative action. It doesn't target the people who are most in need of help. It doesn't specifically target them. It's kind of an equal thing on itself. It's not reparations, for example. So yeah.
I would offer,
but it's necessary for
an analogy to the housing one, where you said people will kind of move to places that are lower cost of living and spread things out like that. You might imagine the equality amongst minorities to be sort of similar, where people aren't able to move, but they can still like send each other resources. And if you're putting more money into the places that don't have as much money, that I think that trade will have a tendency towards an equalizing effect, even if it may not be like perfect or something.
Yeah, certainly. If you're looking at, equality of freedom, if you're making everyone more free, if you're looking at equality of power, of political power, something like that, giving everybody some money makes a much bigger difference than kind of trying to take money away from rich people or something, right? We talk about rich people having too much money and influencing politics. Well, there's also the problem of poorer people not having enough money to have the freedom to participate in politics, to spend their time doing that, or to take time off to go vote, that kind of thing. So I think, there's kind of an outsized impact of giving everybody money that kind of washes out the effects of a few billionaires with a large amount of money. Yeah.
I have a question about that political power before you close. Can you
Sorry, I'm having a hard time. Oh, actually, hold on a second. I might be able to fix this. I have this special.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, hold on. I think what's happening is that I've got my noise reducer software that's making it harder for me to hear you. Go ahead now.
So you were addressing political power.
Yeah.
So if there was a committee meeting on UBI, obviously a congressperson may or may not like the idea, but ultimately they've got to go out to their car and make a phone call to their lobbyists, or the people, the wealthy and well-connected that are supporting them. How can we make sure that the person on the other end of that phone is lobbying for UBI? Because I believe that's probably a more effective tool than poor people clamoring and doing hashtags on Twitter.
Yeah.
How can we do that?
Yeah. So how do you get rich people on board with UBI? I guess is the question, right? And I think
but how can we get rich people to lobby for it?
Well, everyone wants to live in a better world. I think most rich people want to live in a better world. If you're a rich person, you don't want to be living in a world with poverty. Maybe you would prefer that there aren't any poor people, but you don't really want to give up all your money in order to make that happen, or something like that. But I think I don't think there are that many losers with a basic income. Of course, investment bankers, financial sector. There are certain professions that are not going to be necessary as much anymore. But it's a better world for everyone. So I think if you talk to them, if they understand that this is kind of like a necessary piece of infrastructure in the economy that we happen to be missing, then I think they're receptive. Or I don't know what they're going to be receptive to, but that's kind of the approach I take. I'm less political. I'm less involved in kind of the politics of it. I mostly want to
Do you know of any lobbying organizations that are currently lobbying for UBI currently?
Isn't there like a Humanity Forward PAC or something like that? I don't know. What about your group? You're Truckers for Yang, right? Do you lobby people?
Well, correct. I run a super PAC, but I don't have a lobbyist working for me on UBI.
Okay.
But that's part of the plan in the future.
Okay.
So I'm just asking these general questions.
Yeah, I'm not that familiar with that side of things, unfortunately.
That's fine. That's fine. Your talk is amazing. You're unbelievably
cool. Thank you.
Intelligent.
Oh,
and
thank
I'm
you.
going to go to every talk in the future.
Great. Yeah, so we're getting to the end, but Kimberly's had her hand up for a while, so I want to make sure to call on her before we end.
My comment was simply that I think that capitalism has gotten a little out of whack, and people love to embrace capitalism, and we're all kind of saying it's not working. But part of, I think, the problem is that the poor, because the poor have no purchase power, these companies are thriving simply because they have money behind them, not because they're being chosen by a fair market value. And this will provide the fair market value to sort of thrive again. And for, you know, the people to make those choices about what companies that do good service will thrive versus the companies that, you know, have good people who can erase, you know, bad reviews.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You know, it's if the people are the ones with the money, then you kind of have to be accountable to the people. So that's it for today. Thanks everyone. This was our 100th one. I can't believe we made it this far, but we're going to keep going. Next week, we're talking about the Wurgel experiment in Austria in 1932. So basically what they did was they introduced a complementary local currency that it had a negative interest rate on it. So you had to pay interest. You had to pay a certain amount to keep holding the currency. And they used that to encourage people to kind of like keep spending in their economy. So it was a way to kind of activate the economy in kind of some of the ways that I'm talking about now. So we're going to talk about that and to what extent it made sense, to what extent it didn't, and to what extent, you know, it could provide lessons for us today. So that's it. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, everyone.
Happy 100th.
Happy 100th. Yay. Bye.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.